All right, continuing our theme of irregular systems, let's get on with the French. So the French also came over and carved up some land. And the French use a system called the seigneurial system, which we often refer to as French long lots. In Michigan, they specifically call these ribbon farms. And you can see a little section here outside of Detroit with these long, skinny little sections, and then where it's much more common is, of course, along the Mississippi River, long slivers. And the whole point to the long lots was to get river access, right? River transport was a primary mode of shipping goods and services as well as people around the land in, pre-car times. And even still, river transport is pretty significant. The Mississippi River is still a very, very heavily used river for industrial purposes. Many of the rivers in Europe, same thing. So river access was super important, not just for freshwater access, but also for transportation. So the long lot system was set up to give people regular river access. And it was set up kind of like this. And I know this looks much more square here, but you'll see, you can kind of see the ribbons forming. And so basically what would happen is that someone was given a chunk of land because they did a thing and whatever. And that land would then be divided into strips. So the person who was granted the land would, of course, choose the juiciest strip for themselves. But often it was close to the middle because they would also put the public spaces on that land. So you could see there would be a stretch here where maybe the church would be built, or in later times maybe even a school. And so they would take a nice chunk here, and then depending on the depth of the lot, you might also have a road along the back here as well. And then the waterfront itself could sometimes be divided up as common land. It depends. If the strips went all the way to the river and there wasn't a road in the back that kept these folks from having river access, then you wouldn't find this to be common land. It would just be whoever had the access here. But all the lots were controlled by the seigneur, the person who owned the land. And this was measured in arpents, right? So we had all those weird units that went with metes and bounds, rods and chains, and all of that stuff. The French systems are measured in arpents because, standardization, whatever. Also, this is pre-Napoleon, and so the metric system hadn't gained the hold that it did later on. So, anyway, strips of land like this, but rivers are very seldom straight, and so you wind up with these sort of wedges rather than nice thin rectangles. So, like I said, very common along the Mississippi River, right? That whole chunk of the center of the U.S. was controlled by France at one point, and so all up and down the Mississippi you will find these long lots, but you'll also find them in Ohio, and you'll notice I'm going to talk about Ohio through these lectures a lot, partly because I'm from there, but partly because it's also all over the place. We've got some of everything. And so we had the Virginia Military District, which you can just see here on the left-hand side. We had the English systems there. We had a little section down here of French grants, and these were French colonizers who came over and took over a little strip. This is called Gallia County, which is basically from Gallic, which means French, right? The city here is Gallipolis, which is the city of the French. And then there's another little tiny section up in the northern part of Ohio as you get closer to Detroit and the northern French fur trading lands. So you find it in lots of unexpected places, but the vast majority of it you will find along the Mississippi River. And it's really easy to spot it by the air. So remember I said metes and bounds you could often find based on county boundaries. Long lots you can find this way, right? And so you'll commonly find it in what was New France, right, which was this whole center section here. So Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Louisiana, obviously Canada as well. That patch on the Ohio River I showed you, a little random patch in northern Ohio, northwestern Ohio. But here's the thing. Rivers are dynamic. They move, right? So you can see here's this lovely carved up land ownership where people had river access, and then suddenly they don't because the river's over here. So now there's fresh long lots being carved up over here. And so it's kind of challenging, right? And that's one of the issues with irregular systems, because they're often based off natural features, and natural features they do what they want, right? So they change and they shift, and then our land ownership has to keep up with it. And if you look along some of the major rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi, you will find little pieces of states that have been carved off and isolated because the river has moved. So little slivers of a state that are on the other side of the river from the entire rest of the state. And you can just imagine, right? Originally, the boundary was the river. But the river said, yeah, I'm not feeling it. I'm going over here. And so the boundary is then weird. Okay, so these are pretty easy to spot from the air. You're going to find them in the center part of the U.S. for the most part. And then also, as I said, up in Canada as well. We also have Spanish colonial systems. These were also land grants, often given to communities rather than individuals, which is a little different than the French systems or the English systems. Also typically connected to water, but remember, this is going to be mostly in the southwestern part of the U.S. where the Spanish had control. Oddly enough, not so much in Florida, even though the Spanish had control of Florida for a long time, but mostly in the southwestern U.S. And so water access there, you can imagine, is super critical because it's a limited resource in that case. And so they're going to kind of resemble French long lots. They're going to be long, thin strips, as you can see here, connecting to a river. In this case, they were often called a labor and a league rather than a long lot or a seigneurial system or an arpent. The labor would be floodplain, right, because rivers are dynamic, they do their thing, right, and then a league of dry land so that you could plant dry land crops, and then you could also either plant crops that thrive with flooding, periodic flooding, or also harvest and store that water. And these are measured in yet another system, Vara's, cordels, and then also identified as the labor in the league. And if any of you are from San Francisco or have spent a fair amount of time there, you might recognize this area called the 50 Vara district. And it is a chunk of San Francisco. There's more to it than this, but this is pretty much the piece that's still intact, measured in the Spanish Vara. So remember I said you need these units in order to work with modern maps because they didn't go away. Even though we stopped using them, they're still there. So you'll find them in strange and unusual places. In the U.S., I mentioned this is mostly going to be in the Southwest, so you'll find it in Texas, New Mexico, and California predominantly. Sometimes you'll see it on topo maps. You'll see a grant boundary like this that can indicate the edge of one of these grants. Many of them down here along the coast of California. Also, the community of Taos was a grant in this way. And then here you can see, again, an example of some grants carved up along the Arkansas River and the Rio Grande. So, 3 major colonial systems that were used to carve up land here. Like I said, just because we stopped using them didn't make them go away, so it's good to have some familiarity with them as you try to read what the heck these things are, and if you're looking at property maps as well. Okay, so that's it for the irregular systems. The next video I'm going to start talking about the regular systems because, as we've already talked about, basing your boundaries on nature is not usually a good idea because nature doesn't stay put. So regular systems don't pay as much attention to natural boundaries. They're more artificial so that they can be those boundaries regardless of what's happening to the ground underneath. All right, come back for the next one.